Welcome back to the 282nd episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including 2 articles talking about the dismantling of the bureaucratic agencies at the center of our government, as well as talking about a little bit of crypto and some things that are coming down the pike and pipe. And of course, we will end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, right? To take on the day. Now, that's enough rambling for me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So, obviously, with everything that happened with the actual debate between Biden and Trump, I covered it in a podcast, how I don't think Biden did as bad, but that's besides the point. With all of that happening last week, some of these major decisions by the Supreme Court went unnoticed. Some large agencies over the weekend reported on it almost immediately, like the Daily Caller and the New York Times, as well as the Wall Street Journal. We have articles from the Wall Street Journal and the Daily Caller today. But did you get any outside information about this before you got here, or are you coming in fresh? I want to know your opinions on the dismantling of the administrative state. If you've paid attention to the Supreme Court, you know what was possibly coming down the pike. You also know that Chevron deference is basically dead. And I want to know where you sit on all of it before you hear some of these articles, because it may change your opinion. It may make you frustrated with the decisions. It may make you okay with the decisions. It just depends on what argument resonates with you. So let's get into some of those arguments, shall we? We'll go into our first article from the Daily Caller. The headline reads, "This is huge. Supreme Court just gutted the administrative state, and Biden's climate agenda may be hardest hit." And we have known that this Supreme Court for quite some time has been going after bureaucratic agencies, non-elected officials. And it's interesting because Kavanaugh really spent a lot of time inside the government, as well as Sotomayor, and they spent a lot of time actually within the agencies of the government, whether it be in the Bush White House or other White Houses, or even just in different executive agencies. So we know that there is some sentiment here where even if any person or any group contingent, whether it's the 6 or the 3, however you want to align things, the 7 and the 2 based on originalist principles, sometimes with Ketanji Brown Jackson coming down on the side of what would be perceived as conservatives, there are different aligned groups within all of those. Some of them have worked solely in the justice arena. Some people have worked within the executive agencies, and it's always interesting to see some of them play off of one another, especially Kavanaugh, who really came in hard on one of the decisions about how the executive branch, the president specifically, should be able to interact with social media companies and actually have conversations and go back and forth with them about possible rules, restrictions, things like this. That most of the conservatives were like, whoa, big tech should not be colluding with the White House. But Kavanaugh was like, you're basically saying that the White House couldn't talk to any private businesses about what they're doing. So there are lots of diverse perspectives here. But this one did come along these 6-3 lines like you would think, and it really was taking an aim at the people who are not elected by the United States, but rather the population of the United States, rather the people that sit there throughout multiple administrations and keep the workings. Okay, I'll frame it 2 ways. You either think they are the people that keep the workings of the U.S. government rolling no matter what political appointees are there, or you think that they are holdovers that continue to gum up the system. I would say those are probably the 2 main point of views. One of them is liberal, first one I listed. The second one is more conservative. And there is no doubt, and let's be clear, I understand that there is lots of more variation there, but if I had to make it very simple, that's the binary that I would create. And the point that I am getting at here is, even if you don't want to call the justices conservative, they have an originalist point of view, and they have been coming for the administrative state, and it is making the conservatives happy. So, with that said, let's actually get into some of the stuff that's coming in specifically from these decisions, rather than the ones I talked about previously, where we've seen a little bit of, I don't want to say unwillingness, but they were definitely coming after, whether it be different agencies making decisions in the past, but now they're coming for the full suite, and that's what this term is really going to be remembered for, the gutting of administrative agencies overall, whether it be Chevron deference, whether it be different EPA rulings, so on and so forth. Or in this case, it was actually a Federal Trade Commission rule that they were trying to implement about pollution that was one of the key ones that they were going after. But let's get into this specific article. Quote, the Supreme Court issued a major ruling Friday that curbs the power of the administrative state, with the EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, and Biden climate agenda being among the decision's biggest losers. The new legal environment could cause problems for signature Biden EPA rules, such as the power plant emissions reduction regulation and tailpipe standards. Those were the ones that people worried about. Basically, they're being pushed into an EV future, which, whether or not you agree that we should try to get off of gas or not, Biden has definitely said that he would prefer that we are a more renewable friendly nation, and that EV cars, he's given subsidies to different EV companies. He's also given lots of different subsidies to bring manufacturing back into the United States, including some of those EV companies or car companies that are making EVs, depending on, there's only really one EV company now, especially with Fisker out of the game, at least in America, that only sells EVs. But he's been giving money to all these different industries in order to bring them up into a more renewable era. And this tailpipe one was seen to be something that would affect the consumers the most, because it's forcing them into one category, basically saying, oh, well, cars can't have these certain levels of emissions. And it's not even the consumer being like, oh, well, I'll pay a little bit more. It's saying the manufacturers can't even, to some degree, produce certain types of cars. Now, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, I do understand, but that's basically the end goal. And we know that the Biden administration wants to push us towards an EV future anyway. They made multiple speeches about how people should try to get EVs if possible. And also we can see it in their policy with tax credits for EVs that they've done over the duration of the Biden administration. So let's keep rolling here. This is a little bit further down. Quote, formerly one of the most important theories in administrative law, Chevron deference, had held that courts could generally defer to federal agencies' interpretations of statutory ambiguities. So if there's a little bit of wiggle room within any of the laws that are passed, it's not going to be left to the justice system. It's going to be left to the experts who are actually in some of these they are in the executive branch. And this is where we're supposed to hire on our experts. We're supposed to let them really guide policymaking. So at the EPA, you bring in lots of environmental consultants. You bring in climate change experts. You bring in people who have a deep understanding of urban planning if you're looking at HUD, and then they craft policy from there, whether it be Biden says, hey, I want this done, how would we do it? Or Biden leans on them, or any other president leans on them to propose solutions to problems that they think are critical. This is basically an expert class that puts out rules and regulations that directly affect us as a people, and yet we didn't actually directly elect all of them. Now, some appointees are political appointees, like the heads of these actually have to be approved through Congress. Some of the jobs are filled by non-political appointees, and guess what? They don't go, sometimes they do go with the heads when they leave, or the president when they leave, but they don't always have to. Imagine that I get elected. No, that's a little bit too egotistical. Let's say that your Uncle Joe gets elected to Secretary of State. And he gets pulled into the cabinet as Secretary of State. He's not technically elected, he's appointed, and he gets approved. And your Uncle Joe has some really crazy theories about what random nation, let's say Indonesia. He doesn't really like Indonesia, and he brings in Indonesia hardliners into the administration that aren't political appointees, and they can stay in that office even after Uncle Joe leaves, and you don't like his position on Indonesia, and yet he has left a permanent mark on the administrative state. And also, think about it this way. When the next person comes in, and Uncle Joe's crazy people who have really, put a little niche in there for their Indonesia policy, they don't want to lose their job, so they're going to try to push back. They're going to do what they can in order to make sure that they're not losing their position in the federal government. And then you have an entrenched bureaucracy. I know, it's a very simplistic version, and a lot of these people, and I'm not trying to just hate on bureaucrats, a lot of these people genuinely do care about the United States of America, and they are trying their best to do what they believe is the correct path forward and trying to serve their country. That's fair enough, but I'll tell you now, if you have a holdover from the 1980s in there and they haven't adjusted their policy, or even if they've slightly adjusted their policy, but they still have some entrenchments from the 1980s, some people would love that. Some conservatives actually would probably say, no, actually, we want to keep some of these people here, which is ironic because the conservatives don't like the bureaucracy in general. But yet, if they have a more conservative, how should I say, traditionalist view, or at least harkening back to previous times when things were different view of the bureaucracy, maybe they would have a different perspective than getting rid of the person who was brought in under Obama. Maybe they would be more selective. Actually, they won't be able to if Trump gets in another time, or even Vivek Ramaswamy said, yeah, if I get in, I'm going to call all these people. They couldn't do it by ideology. They would have to do it randomly, which is very, very interesting. But the point I'm getting at with this is there are a swath of people who have been entrenched in there for so long. And even if one side likes the people that are entrenched from 2 different administrations ago, guess what? We're constantly spending more money on them. And we are also really relying on them to get certain things done. And that's fair enough. They know their job, they're good at it. But what if they have, and I know I just said that they're serving the United States, but what if they believe that in serving the United States, it would actually be better to stall a certain type of policy so that it doesn't get through? Maybe there's a Democrat who gets in, and there's an older gentleman who is conservative. His foreign policy is based in the 1980s. It is a full-on Israel love fest. And a Democrat nowadays gets in and say, hey, we actually need to consider a different perspective on this, and he drags his feet. He doesn't put in a memorandum. He leaves out certain information. Sure, that could be warrants to fire him, but maybe it's too late by the time that they find out this information was left out. This is something that can happen when you have people that are directly opposed to you. Now, I have previously talked about how the fact that we want the government to be slow and how we don't necessarily want it to be, I don't want to say we don't want it to be ineffective. That's not fair. But we at least want things to filter through very slowly and have to go through multiple minds. But that's on the legislative side. On the executive side, you shouldn't be making as many rules and regulations as they are in the first place. That should be basically, because they have the power of laws, that should be in the legislator's point of view. It should be passed by them first. So, at the end of the day, the executive is just supposed to execute. That is what they're supposed to be there for. Why do we need all these expert bureaucrats? Maybe every once in a while to actually make sure that something gets put in that's a little bit too broad, fair enough, but you bring them in for a special project, you put the rule in place, and you let it go. And then you have an expiration date on the rule, or you have a review date on the rule. Then you bring in another special counsel. Not only are we cutting the budget for these people for what? I mean, if they're there for 10 months making the rule and it gets published and then they have to come back every 4 years, we're cutting the budget for all that time in between. But also, we're saying, okay, there's room to improve. Maybe there's a really new up-and-coming climate scientist who wants to come in, and previously, the Biden administration, if it was under the previous rules and they're not actually having this new system that I'm pretending we have, where, we have a revolving door and they come back to rules after a little bit of time and they bring in a council. No, this would most likely be if it was a 4-year period and it was done at the very beginning of a president's administration and they win re-election, they're probably going to have the same people on that council, maybe 1 or 2 changes, versus because they've been in the administrative state this whole time. They've been the ones sitting there saying, okay, yeah, we put this rule in place, now we're looking at feedback, versus allowing some new fresh ideas on there. That's the whole point of having a revolving door. And normally that term is used in a negative way, but having a revolving door where people are brought in, elected on off years, we have a giant cycle to ensure that nothing is all in sync. So it's not one giant change, except for maybe on certain presidential years. But even then, there are runoff elections. There's another election in 2 years that allows the people to speak their mind. Everything is constantly evolving. The populist movement that came in under Trump, it was not the same populist movement as 2016. It changed during 2018. It changed into 2020, and now it's changed going into 2024. His movement, what he stands for, who he's going for money, all of these things have changed, just like Biden's positions on multiple issues have changed in those 2 years. Now, whether he's doing it because he really believes these things, he's been presented new evidence, or he's trying to win a political coalition, I think actually, even though I don't necessarily like the latter, where it's just appealing to a coalition, because that means that he doesn't necessarily have principles, and that would be the same thing for Donald Trump when he's just randomly changing what he's saying. Okay, I'm going to slow down. What I was getting at there is, even though I may not like that he's just trying to appeal to a different coalition, he doesn't have any principles, at least it really emphasizes the fact that you still have to appeal to different contingents of voters and that people's sentiments change on particular issues. And if that can happen, where Joe Biden has to completely change the type of people that he's appealing to within a 2-year period versus the people at the midterms in 2022 or the 2024 contingent that he's trying to pull in, that proves that sentiments change, and therefore you bring up certain councils to get certain things done at certain times. If you really want to have experts there in the executive branch, that's how you would do it. Even then, some people would probably argue that is too overly bloated. But I think the Daily Caller really summarizes everything I just went into very, very nicely in basically one line. Quote, the era of, quote, trust the experts, end quote, is over. Mandy Gunshkar, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, who served as EPA chief of staff during the Trump administration, told the DCNF, which is Daily Caller News Foundation, quote, there's no doubt that crafty administrative lawyers will try to find an end run around this ruling, but overturning Chevron deference alongside the major questions doctrine decision versus West Virginia versus EPA. Oh, okay. So I actually was wrong. It was not the FTC that they were talking about, the different emissions going across the borders. It was actually the EPA, because that's what they're talking about here with the West Virginia case. They were trying to limit the emissions from coal plants from West Virginia by saying, hey, well, actually, some of your pollution, the negative externalities, if we're going to use it in an economics term, of your economic growth, your economic system within West Virginia is actually negatively affecting other states. And the reason I thought it was the FTC is because it's the Trade Commission and they actually deal with some of the interstate commerce a little bit. So, but no, I mean, it does make sense that it was underneath the EPA. But my point being that all of these things, all of these different proposals that the Biden administration has been putting in, going through the education department to do some of his student loans, the forgiveness, guess what? And actually, the student loan one is interesting because it's an interpretation of a legal precedent that was, in the Higher Education Act. So that one actually is pretty interesting, and maybe you could make an argument that's actually enforcing what's directly in the law. I'm pretty sure progressives would also make that because they were making the claim that Joe Biden was trying to use some fancy techniques when it was already in the Higher Education Act, that he can just do this. So I think it will be interesting for sure in that case. But a lot of these rules and regulations have just been crafted up by the Biden administration. And that is, I don't want to say it's necessarily bad, because as I've talked about before, if the legislator will not legislate and the people are yearning for certain things, and the president, who has the how to put it, the popular right, the election has determined that they are speaking for the people, so to speak. They have the mandate, the popular mandate, and they are trying to respond to what the people want. I think to some level you could make that argument and it really resonates, and it honestly sits on me for a second and say, okay, yeah, I do understand where you're coming from, especially when the legislator will not legislate, when they will not move. But as we've talked before, the whole point of the legislator is to be slow, and the point of the executive is not to just whole cloth make up their own rules, but rather to enforce the rules of the legislator. If you truly believe that the system is so broken that it needs to be changed whole cloth, or at least there needs to be amendments in there where it's clearly stated that the executive has the power to do this, bring together a convention of the states. I'll tell you now, the states are not going to be willing, each individual state, even if you try to get all of the Democratic states and Republican states now, you're going to have a contingent within each and every one of them that will not be okay with giving away that much power to the federal government explicitly in the Constitution. Because right now, a lot of the states that are able to push back, like West Virginia versus EPA, that are able to push back on these rules put out by the executive agencies rather than the legislator, is because they are questioning the constitutionality of the executive branch doing this. And they're actually saying, hey, no, these executive branches, they don't have the authority to do it, and they are infringing upon our ability to operate as states. And if the states explicitly give that power away to the executive because people are frustrated with the way that the legislator doesn't want to do its job and that they believe the president has a popular mandate, I don't see that happening. Even if all the states turn blue, I genuinely do not see all of them saying that, even for a Democratic president, because guess what? This is one of those perfect examples where you turn around 4 years later, you turn around 8 years later, and if it doesn't come up Democrat every single time, then you are going to regret it, because you have just empowered the executive to have even more authority over your states, and that is not going to be enjoyable. And I think that's why you would have a strong contingent, even among Democrats, or especially among Republicans, that would say, don't do it. It'd be like Mitch McConnell's famous quote, you don't sow these seeds, don't plant these seeds, because you are going to regret it eventually. So let's jump into a different perspective, also talking about the administrative agencies that Biden's been using, but how this could actually derail a lot of his plans. Specifically, it comes from the Wall Street Journal. Supreme Court puts Biden policies like net neutrality, ban on non-competes contracts at risk. So, this is also another one that is coming through the FTC, the non-compete contracts. That one is very, very interesting in my opinion. And it was actually kind of lauded by a lot of progressives. And I kind of understand why, which is large companies, and progressives see large companies as evil. And to some degree, the part of me that is a little bit more populist and understands where they're coming from, that they wield exorbitant amounts of power. I understand where they're coming from, and the idea that you can have a massive company basically saying, oh yeah, we're going to make you sign a giant non-compete, and since we're basically among 2 or 3 of the largest companies even in this sphere, we're not going to allow you to go to any of our competitors, so you're basically locked in. That does seem like anti-competitive behavior. I always lean back on the fact that, well, it's a contract, and just like any other contract, if you don't want the job, then you don't have to sign it. There would be an argument, which is, well, okay, you're basically putting them in a no-win situation. If they don't sign it, they may not get a very lucrative job. They may get bad talked by people in the industry, which is fair enough. When my principle of you're still signing a contract comes up against the real world, I do hear those arguments. And I've actually used some of those arguments before when trying to say, no, you're actually not giving me a choice in this situation, even though you think you are. So I understand where they're coming from for sure, but now there doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether they like it or not. This is going to run into problems, because now Chevron deference has basically said, if you bring a case, if a lawyer or anyone wants to sue and they bring a case, we're not going to, we're instructing our lower courts, but also as the Supreme Court, we're not just going to defer to the experts. So we're actually allowed to really jump in here and judge whether or not these rules that you're making and you're saying that are important to put out there are actually going to, 1, serve their purpose, but 2, fall within the purview of the legislation that was put out. And if there are those strategic ambiguities that the legislator purposely puts in there to say, oh, well, they can cover anything that goes through American waterways, or any tributary to a waterway, or anything that is a watershed of XYZ area, that covers a lot of different water. And we've had issues of this in the past, actually. There have been Supreme Court cases that have decided where the water rights actually lie in certain cases, because otherwise, if it was all the tributaries, it would just basically be owned by the United States government. There have been conflicts on these sort of things before, and a lot of this lies with the EPA trying to overstep its bounds, using some of the ambiguity in some of the legislation. And in the past, it's been struck down, even when the experts have most definitely said that this is something that's essential to do. But now it opens the door even more, because now the precedent is no longer set on the Supreme Court scale, but also they're telling the lower courts to do this. So they may not even have to get those certain cases up to the Supreme Court before it's struck down, and these agencies don't get necessarily what they want. But sorry, I went a little bit off track here. Let's jump into a quote or two from the Wall Street Journal article. Quote, "It's hard to overstate the impact that this ruling could have on the regulatory landscape in the United States going forward," said Lee Malone, a lawyer at Simpson Thacher and Barnett. "This could really bind U.S. agencies in their efforts to write new rules." In a 6-3 decision written by Chief Justice John Roberts, the court's Okay, hold on. Let me see here. The court abandoned, why not just say the court overturned, but interesting. The court abandoned a legal doctrine called Chevron deference, which has long helped federal agencies defend their regulations in court when challenged by industry groups. And the doctrine was created in the High Court in the 1984 case. Stood for the idea that judges should defer to executive branch agencies when it comes to interpreting gaps and ambiguities in the laws they implement, so long as those interpretations are reasonable. So like I said before, there is the gap rule. Oh, okay, this is not necessarily explained, but also there is always the reason rule. Now, the reason rule, there are lots of different cases of, a reasonable person. There's that rule specifically, or the reason. Like, there are so many different interpretations of what reasonable means, and what would a reasonable person think? It's their own strategic ambiguity that the court gets to use however they so please. So I always hate those sort of rules where, it's up to the average person's reason, or it's up to our reason. If you look at somebody who is a Democrat and someone who is a Republican, someone who is a libertarian versus someone who is a statist, someone who is an anarchist versus an institutionalist, all these different points of view, no matter where you come from, they're going to have different standards of reasonable. If you ask a progressive whether or not it's reasonable to believe that corporations are evil and that they're coming to get you, they're probably going to say that's pretty reasonable. If you are asking a libertarian, is it reasonable to believe that the state's not on your side and that's coming to get you, they're going to say that's pretty reasonable to believe that. So the standards for reasonable are kind of shoddy and they're all over the place. But the point being that it's overturned now. And I wanted to make sure that we got that background in there before we move on to the fate of some of the different policies. And the one that I really, really wanted to focus on is actually net neutrality, because I think it's going to be interesting for sure. I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs. If you want to read more about it, if this is intriguing to you, you can go into it. The links for all of these articles will be in the description below the like and subscribe button. So, quote, "Now that Chevron deference is gone, the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, is expected to have a harder time reviewing net neutrality, a set of policies barring internet service providers from assigning priority to certain web traffic." So think of it this way. Google pays Comcast a little bit more, or Google brings in more traffic than other websites. So Comcast is saying, okay, hey, we want to prioritize them so that they want stay and they're actually used by our customers, and then they have more ads run on them, so then they can pay larger service fees, whatever it may be, whether it's because people pay for it or just because the traffic requires it. Comcast or any other service provider may actually adjust the weights and say this company gets it more than others. They could basically, it's a little tenuous, they could basically banish certain companies or certain websites basically to the dark web. I mean, they could just shove it back there and say, oh, no, we're not giving it at the time. It's a little bit, once again, a little bit more complicated than this. If you grew up during the Obama time, this was a huge battle. I mean, Facebook ran ads on whole bunch of different videos. My friends were showing me some of the ads, and I didn't have a phone at the time, so it's very interesting, no doubt. Quote, "Net neutrality provisions introduced during the Obama administration," oh, look, I just talked about that, "scrapped during the Trump presidency, but in April, the Biden administration said that they were coming back. To do that, the FCC reclassified internet providers as public utilities under the Communications Act. There was pending court case challenging the FCC's reinterpretation of the 1934 law." Think about it. Wow, just think about that. Which, let's be clear, I'm going to make an argument here. Doesn't mean that it 100% holds true, but let's think about this for a second. A 1934 law, a law passed nearly 90, it's exactly 90 years now. 90 years ago. And they're using it as precedent to reinterpret what these companies are. Now, like I said, there is a counter argument, which is, at this point, they basically are public utilities, kind of. What does that actually mean, though? If they're a public utility, are they going to be allowed natural monopolies like certain electric companies are provided? And even that's actually, I take that back, because it's starting to change now that lots of people can kind of, they can do like surge pricing, and it's getting a little bit more complicated. No longer a natural monopoly monopoly is just allowed to exist anymore. Maybe if you're in Virginia, it's become more of a regional monopoly because the infrastructure has been built up by other people. It's okay. It's really complicated. And that was not actually the point that I wanted to get to, even though it's a very interesting conversation. Sure, we'll do one about it in the future. But the point I'm getting at here is, what is it? What do you mean by public utility? Are they actually a public utility? There's precedent for years upon years of what we call public utilities. That's fair enough. But I don't necessarily know if the internet is a public utility. Is it really? Is it something that everybody deserves the right to? I don't personally think so. I don't think that it's something that the government should fund outright, because that's what a public utility would be. If they're going to, especially if they're going to classify it as such on the federal government level, I could see federal government infrastructure. And then again, the federal government has put infrastructure into getting not 5G, broadband into a whole bunch of different places. So there's lots of government subsidized stuff like that. But what's the next thing? They're going to start investing in Starlink so that every single person can have internet across the United States and basically call it a joint program between the U.S. government and Starlink. What does that mean if the U.S. government says, actually, no, for you, you don't get a certain, you don't actually get access to this public utility because you violated X, Y, and Z? Or I don't know. There's interesting nuances here. Maybe I'm being paranoid, but is it really a public utility? Is it something that we all deserve the right to? Nowadays, it is something that is integral to a lot of people's jobs, to people's existences, to how you communicate with your family. So maybe it's an interesting one for sure. But the point being that rule is possibly out the door. So we've seen that Chevron deference is going to cause some key issues here, and that the Biden administration is not going to like it. But I think that we've talked about those enough. If you want to read out of the articles, like I said, links in the description below, the like and subscribe button. But I want to move on to our other article that I said we were going to talk about, and it'll be very brief, no more than 4 minutes. I think that gives me enough time. It comes from ambcrypto.com, smaller publication, not the most out there crazy expensive publication that can do all the most research, but it's very, very interesting for sure what they're talking about. The headline reads, BlackRock makes a surprising move as Bitcoin reacts. All the details. So actually, and I think that they made I'm going to be honest, I think that they made their picture for the top of their article with ChatGPT. That's just a guess because it kind of has that certain style that a lot of the image generators did, maybe Midjourney. But the point being that what they're talking about is a company actually offloaded, I'll read it here, quote, as of the 27th of June, GBTC was the only BTC, Bitcoin ETF, electronically traded fund, to record let me take a step back, 11.4 million in outflows, while others recorded inflows or remained neutral with zero inflows or outflows. Now, what's very, very important here is the next paragraph. Quote, while BTC's spot ETF market has seen its fair share of volatility since its approval, so basically up and down ever since they actually got permission to have these different ETFs that correspond or relate to Bitcoin holdings and actual Bitcoin. Quote, it's worth noting that at press time, iShares Bitcoin Trust, IBIT, if you're looking for the ticker, at BlackRock was the only one that stood out with zero outflows since the 10th of June. So basically, and they actually go on to talk about how they brought in that they possibly opened another account, which is a little speculative, that they may be bringing more Bitcoin down into their portfolio. But the point being that they have not sold since June 10. This is at least the argument here is this is a strong sign that they believe they at least need to hold for a while, and that they're trying to really stay through some of these different anxieties in the market. As we saw it hit 70, now it's coming back down to 60, and it's kind of floating there for a little bit, even though they haven't hit the point where it's going to break through the 70 mark and possibly make that run towards 100, which everybody always talks about. So I'm just kind of feeding into that there. But the point being that they actually, and I'm going to read this next part, quote, BlackRock's global allocation fund now holds 43,000 shares of IBIT, like I mentioned, iShares Bitcoin Trust. That makes it the third it makes it the third internal BlackRock fund to invest in BTC. So they're going heavy into Bitcoin. They are saying, hey, at the end of the day, this is what we want to do. We want to be in this position. We want to hold the assets. Maybe that's because they want to make their own, how should I say, funding system in the future, or they want to make their own, maybe paying service, or they want to be able to facilitate a sort of network crypto paying service in the future. So they have to have a lot of the asset. They also want to believe in it. So they're holding it and keeping the price so then they can also make money off it. I don't know. There's lots of different speculation here. All of that is just speculation. I have no information besides what was read from the article in quotes. Everything else is just my speculation. But it's definitely interesting, to say the least, that BlackRock, who was kind of skeptical, they were a little skeptical at first, is now at least staying steady on their crypto holdings. Then again, it is specifically Bitcoin. So this is not financial advice, but remember that they're not going out and buying all the obscure coins. They're buying Bitcoin because at this point, there's at least enough of a name recognition with even the older groups that they can get away with just having that one. With obscure coins, be careful. That's all I'm saying. So with all that, let's jump into our daily delight. This one comes from Laughing Squid. It's been a while since we've done one from them. Baby birds rest in nest hanging on front door. And I'll be honest, when I saw this photo, it's the little babies chilling in a nest on the front door. But what's even better is there's a little note on the door. So they have a photo of the door shut. So she's taking it from the outside. And then a photo of the door while it's open. And she has written a reminder for herself that, hey, remember, door equals baby birds. And it has a little shocked face on it, birds flying away. It's honestly adorable. If you want to check out this article, the Instagram post is also linked there, so there's a video that you can watch. Or, like I said, if you want to check out any of today's articles, all of them will be linked in the description below the like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can follow the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast. I'm going to leave Google Podcasts in there probably for the next week, and then I'm going to remove it. It's just so ingrained in how I say my speech, because I say Spotify, Pocket Cast, Google Podcasts, as well as Podvine, which you can check it out on Podvine if you want. And then also the Twitter handle at your DailyFlip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. But I promise we're going to get that Google Podcast out of my mind for the next time, because if you don't know, the company, or at least the website, is basically shutting down at this point. So with all of that said, thank you for joining me for this episode of the Daily Flip podcast. And there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.